Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So this is the long-promised movie fight review of Hector versus Achilles from the 2004 film Troy. I've got quite a few things to say about this fight, but first up I should start by saying that I actually, contrary to lots of people out there, I actually really like the film Troy. I like the way they've done some of the story. I don't care that much about the discrepancies from the original Iliad, and I like the actors and I like the fighting in general. There are some things in Troy, particularly in the battle scenes, which really bother me, but the one-on-one fighting I think is very well choreographed and very entertaining. And as I've said in other movie fight reviews, for me, I'm not really fastidious about fights in movies in terms of I believe that they should be entertaining first and foremost. If they're historically inaccurate, it might bother me a bit. If they don't make sense within the context of the story, it might bother me a bit. But overall, the most important thing is always that they're entertaining. And I certainly think that the fight in Troy is done well and done athletically. So, first thing I'll say, and I'll try and keep this relatively brief because there's a lot of things I could say about this. First up, the armour and shields. I pretty much like the way the armour's done. It's not terribly authentic to period, but it's got a nice look about it. It looks the part. The shields they're using are very particular in Troy, and this will relate to some of the things I'll say later about the fighting, and that is they look very heavy, needlessly heavy, I would say. They seem to be like wooden shields that are bronze plated, or at least that's what we're supposed to, what's supposed to be implied by the sounds and stuff that weapons make against them. Now, there's no problem with that. That is kind of authentic, certainly for a later period. I believe, historically speaking, they should maybe be using more wicker shields and hide shields and things like this in this period. But wooden shields with bronze facing, certainly contemporary with the kind of hoplite Spartan later Greek period. But the thing to remember is that the wood would be quite thin and the bronze would be quite thin, and the shield, if it's too heavy, becomes not very useful as a fighting object. Unless you're using it like a pavis in a siege or such like, then it's not for this type of one-on-one fighting, it wouldn't be very useful if it was an overly heavy shield. So, first up, talking about the actual fighting itself. One thing I do like about this fight is they use lots of dodging, and particularly with spear, because spear can only really offend with the point. It's a thrusting weapon. Dodging and avoidance is quite important and quite a useful thing against the spear. And it's really good that they've incorporated that into this fight between Hector and Achilles. I was impressed to see that, and it's good to see that they're not trying to block everything and that they are just avoiding some of the time. However, I'll come back to that point in a little bit. Moving chronologically through the fight as it happens, there is a shield strike done right at the beginning by Achilles that's done so close that it kind of, you wonder how he got that close if he was really trying to hit Hector with his spear. He kind of charges at Hector, and you could say maybe he's toying with him and he's just charging him to show that he can close on him. So that's okay, I'll forgive that, but there is a strange, from a martial arts point of view, it's a bit strange how he gets from spear range to shield range so quickly, but again that could be to show Achilles' skill and the fact that he's to an extent toying with Hector. So next up, there's a thrust, a very hard thrust. In fact, there are a number of these in the fight, but very early on in the fight, in the second exchange I think, there's a spear thrust that's very hard into Hector's shield. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. Firstly, if you're using a bronze-headed spear and you're thrusting it very hard into a bronze-plated shield, and it makes a very metallic sound when it hits, and hits very abruptly, there are two issues with that. Firstly, you're going to blunt your spear, which isn't a very good thing. Secondly, if it doesn't blunt the spear, it's going to possibly get stuck in the shield, so that's also not a very good thing. And this relates to some of the strikes with the swords on the shield as well. And generally speaking, if you launch a hard strike, yes, sometimes it will hit a shield hard. If that happens, there's a large chance that the weapon will get stuck in the shield. However, if possible, what you want to do is avoid, and I would assume that Achilles has the skill to do this, I would hope that Achilles would try and avoid just slamming the point of his spear into the opponent's shield, for fear of it getting either stuck, which would disarm him, or indeed just blunting or breaking his own spear. So I think that was kind of like a bad decision on Achilles' part to do that into Hector's shield. Next up we see Hector blocking a thrust at his legs, at his lower legs, his shins, from Achilles, blocking it with his shield. Now this is a particularly stupid thing to do. First of all, these are large, heavy shields. If someone thrusts at your legs, you do what's called a slip of the legs. That is, you just move the legs back and you attack in the high line. This is across fencing sources from the Middle Ages, from 1300 all the way through to modern martial arts practice. Okay, so the fact that he drops the large shield down to protect his legs, thus exposing his upper parts, is pretty silly and also pretty slow. Your chances of blocking a thrust at your leg with the shield is a very, very slim chance of doing that. The only type of shield you can convincingly do that with is a long shield, such as a pavis, sometimes known as a tower shield, or a Norman type teardrop shield. Okay, so not with the circular shield. You'd have to stretch down or bend down or lower yourself down too far to be able to block it in time. The spear thrust is much, much quicker. Next up we see Achilles twirling his spear around a lot, seeming to threaten with strikes from the spear, which, to be honest, with a light spear shaft held one-handed, with the spear of a twirl alone, is never actually going to really do much if it does connect. It will just sting slightly. But what is nice is that when twirling it, he is threatening thrusts with the back end of the spear. Now, as far as I can see, there is nothing on the back end of his spear. However, we know that many spears in the ancient period were double-ended, in that you had a bronze ferrule or foot on the other end of the spear that you could indeed poke people with. Certainly if it hits you in the face, it might do you some nasty injury, and if it hits you anywhere else, it might just hurt you slightly or distract you. So I'm not a big fan of the spear twirling. However, in spear fighting there are times when you do have to turn the spear around quite quickly, and so I forgive that, and it looks cool. Okay, which is always important in a movie fight. Next up, we see both fighters occasionally supporting their spear shafts on the edge of the shield. This is actually a good thing. I think I recall that the person who choreographed this fight has a Filipino martial arts background, so it's quite surprising that they came up with that, because in Filipino martial arts, as far as I know, there's nothing involving spear and shield, so presumably they just applied their martial arts knowledge to this particular fight with these weapons, this equipment. And that's pretty good. I quite like the idea. It seems convincing to me that you would rest your spear on your shield at various times, and you can say it's kind of shown in medieval and ancient artwork. I am not aware of it ever being advised in a treatise, in a medieval or Renaissance treatise. However, it has to be said, there's very little material for spear and shield used together in medieval and Renaissance treatises. Off the top of my head, I can only think of the Bolognese sources that really touch on it. There might be a couple of other later Italian sources that mention it as well, but it's not heavily dealt with in the fencing treatises. So, as an extrapolation of plausible technique, I think that's good. Next up, we see that Hector kind of locks Achilles' spear between his spear shaft and his shield, in an attempt to kind of disarm and closing technique. And Achilles, in typical Achilles fashions, kind of spins around and breaks through, essentially chops off Hector's spear with the edge of his shield. Now, graphically, in terms of the fight and how it looks excellent, so I wouldn't criticise it from that point of view. Mechanically, from a realistic point of view, I'd criticise it because this is, I would contend, pretty much impossible to do with the edge of a shield in that position. Yes, if you balanced a spear shaft across two solid objects such as rocks, and with all of your force slammed the edge of a heavy shield down onto the edge of the spear shaft, you may possibly be able to snap it. However, even then, you would be very lucky, I would argue, to be able to successfully snap it. Spear shafts are made of ash, ash you can make a longbow out of. It is a flexible wood. If you get it and flex it, it will bend. You won't be strong enough to do it, but if you get two people or a group of people to bend a piece of ash, it will flex quite a lot. That's why it's used for spear shafts, and indeed, of course, it's used in lances and can withstand huge forces. So being able to just sort of swing a shield through a spear is kind of movie bullshit, I'm afraid. You could do it against balsa wood, but I don't think you could even do it against pine wood, and you certainly couldn't do it against an ash spear shaft or any other wood that you might use for a spear shaft. Okay, so next up, Hector, generally speaking, one of the things that annoys me about Hector's fighting style is I know he's supposed to be tired and desperate, and Achilles is essentially toying with him and is definitely the better fighter in the movie, maybe not necessarily in the original story. But Hector swings far too wildly with whatever he's holding, okay? But particularly with the sword, and particularly with the shield, okay? And we see him swinging his shield around a lot like this. This is not how you use a shield, guys. A shield, especially their shields, are large, heavy objects, okay? You have the shield closing a line, and occasionally you move it a bit within the kind of silhouette of your own shape, okay? But you don't swing it around wildly like this, because every time you do that, you're massively exposing yourself. And you're tiring yourself out. It takes a huge amount of muscular exertion and breath to move around a large heavy object like the shields that they're using in this fight. And even with something small like a buckler, you don't move a buckler around that much. You certainly don't do it with a large shield. So he's flapping his shield around far too much. And connected to that point, both fighters in this fight often do things with their weapon, whether it's the spear or the sword, and end up with their shield behind their body. Now, if you're at very long range with the spear, that's kind of forgivable. With a sword, it's completely unforgivable, and it's an idiotic thing to do with a shield, okay? Again, it equates to swinging the shield around too much and using more energy than you really need to. But it's a shield, guys. It's supposed to be there to protect you. It's not going to protect you behind your head. Okay, and sometimes they do this when they're in very close engagement, particularly with the swords, and I think it's probably because the director wants to see what the swords are doing and kind of show off the complexity of the weapon movements, and so he's like, yeah, well, let's get the shield out of the way. But they've got no reason to be holding a shield if they're going to hold it behind their back. Okay, so next thing I would say about the sword work is that sword work looks generally good. I can't say it's historical because we know nothing at all about Bronze Age swordsmanship, okay? But generally speaking, it looks good. They're mostly using the point, which I think they probably should be with this kind of short sword. Yeah, it looks pretty good. However, my criticism of the sword work would again come back to how Hector's fighting. And Hector's got a short sword of about that length, about the size of a a machete or something, or even shorter than a machete. And he's swinging it like this. Okay? Even a sabre, you shouldn't be swinging like this. There's no reason on earth to be swinging a weapon, a bronze sword that's about this long and weighs about as much as a large carving knife, like this, okay? So it's a bit ridiculous how he's swinging the object and making it look very heavy, when actually it certainly shouldn't, even if the movie prop was very heavy, which it probably wasn't, but even if that was heavy, the real thing shouldn't be heavy, okay? It should be a small, nimble weapon, and cuts can be given all in front of the body from, yeah, you're still moving the elbow, the shoulder and the wrist, but you could certainly give wrist cuts, elbow cuts, and even if you were bringing it back to keep the hand protected, the weapon should be kept in front of the body if you're fighting one opponent all the time. You shouldn't be like swinging the thing wildly around, because every time you do that, you're exposing yourself to the opponent hitting you. Okay? And lastly, I couldn't do a video about this fight between Hector and Achilles without mentioning Achilles' trademark move of jumping in the air and doing his big stab, either with a spear or with a sword. I actually don't have a problem with this. One of my students in my club in sparring likes to do this kind of thing, particularly with rapiers, but also with spears. And you know what? I won't say it works, but it doesn't not work. It doesn't really do any harm. In fact, it doesn't really do anything, okay? You've got to remember that fighting, martial arts, fencing work on the principle of tempos, okay? And the tempo or time that it takes a person to jump in the air is far slower than the weapon. But if you notice, the way that he generally uses it is he generally jumps in the air from out of distance and then gives a thrust. And in actual fact, it's no different to just giving a thrust. The only slight difference is it comes from a slightly higher angle and slightly more from the right-hand side. Big deal, okay? If you've got a shield, it's no problem to deal with. In fact, even if you haven't got a shield, it's no problem to deal with, because you can see the person jumping in the air and go, oh, I see what they're going to do. They're going to do this, okay? Because it's the only thing they can do from there. So there we go. I hope that was pleasing to some of you. I know that lots of you have been waiting a long time for me to review this fight. I should finish up by saying I do enjoy watching it. It's one of my favourite fights, actually, in modern cinema, partly because it's an unusual weapon set that's not treated very often, spear and shield, and yet the spear and shield is probably the most common weapon set from antiquity right the way through to, you know, the middle of the Middle Ages. So it's great to see spear and shield actually treated in a film. I like the actors, I like the athleticism, I think it's entertainingly done, I like the fact that it's shown widescreen and you can see everything that's going on. I hate these little fights where you can never see both the people and they just cut and you can't see what's going on. So in terms of cinematography and the story, I love this fight. In terms of the details of the techniques, I'd change a few things, but hey, nothing's perfect. Okay, cheers!